Hi, everyone. Welcome to Literary Ramblings, your monthly or semi-monthly podcast by me, Corrie, and
Charlotte.
yep. And so every month we read a book and we take turns picking a book. We go back and forth, and then we talk about it at the end of the month. And this month is going to be a little bit late since this is supposed to be for May, and I don't know if we're going to get it out in May or not. Miracles do happen, so
We're gonna do our
maybe.
best.
Yeah, well, lots of stuff has been happening this May, but it's also we read a fairly long book. We read The Ruin of Kings by Jenn Lyons. It is a high fantasy novel. It's the first book in a 5-book series, and I
Corey's in
gotta
charge of the summary here.
yeah, and I gotta come up with a summary. It's about the main character's name is Kieran. He's a teenaged boy. We start the book when he is about 14, or was it 12? We start the book in the early teen and tween years, and he goes through a lot of stuff. It's sort of like a mix of a series of unfortunate events and like maybe the chosen one kind of trope. This is a lot harder than I thought it would be. I thought I could wing this without writing anything for it. Now I don't think I can.
I winged Phantom of the Opera, but that was only because I love that and have already seen multiple versions. So
Yeah. This one, I find in general, fantasy novels are kind of hard to pin down, especially high fantasy novels, because there's just so much that goes into them. This story is framed by, I don't know. Okay, so if you're unfamiliar with how framing is, it's when it's a literary device where you have something going on at the beginning of your novel and then we circle back to it basically at the end. That's a very general way to think about it. And in this novel, she uses a framing device where we meet Kieran and another character named Talon in the very first scene, and Kieran is in a jail cell and Talon is the jailer. And Talon tells Kieran to tell her a story and basically to tell her his story. And so that's where we start off with this. It's actually framed again. That's the secondary framing.
yes,
The first one is
yeah.
a letter to the emperor. So it's this is harder than I thought it was going to be. Charlotte.
So there's a character. The second framing device is a character who's adding footnotes throughout the novel, who has clearly listened to the story that's being recorded in the main, level of the tale.
Yeah. So if that wasn't confusing enough, then we just start on Kieran's journey. So Kieran starts telling his story, and at the end of the first chapter, Talon says that she doesn't like where he started it. So she starts telling his story as well because she also knows, she basically knows the whole tale anyway. So she starts his story in a different place. So we have one main character, which is Kieran, and we are learning his story through two different timelines essentially. One starts when he is like 12, and then the other one, oh no, one starts when he's 15. It does say that right at the beginning of this chapter. And then the other one starts when he's older, like 8, like 18.
18? Yeah.
So it's not, I don't know if I want to get ahead of myself here, but basically this is your spoiler warning now. I'm going to drop it as early as possible because it's really hard to talk about high fantasy novels that are over 500 pages long without giving some spoilers. We don't tend to share really major things when we talk about the books, but it kind of does depend on the person how much of a spoiler something is. So we're gonna try not to reveal like crazy things, but we're gonna talk about a lot of things that happen. So this is your official spoiler warning.
Beware.
So ominous. But so I was gonna say that the timelines, I had a problem with the timeline because I found it particularly confusing. I don't mind when stories go back and forth, even between one person's timeline. Like if you have, you're telling the story when he was younger and older. But I think that my problem with this timeline is because they are so close together already. They're only like 3 or 4 years apart where we start. So
Yeah.
it's just so close. There's not enough hints or information that changes. Like Kieran doesn't change as a person enough in 3 years for me to instantly know what timeline I'm in. Especially once they start name dropping in both timelines, like different people who obviously he meets when he's younger and then he meets again when he's older, or like names that he hears when he's younger and then he actually meets the person later.
Mm-hmm. And
So
I mean, I think the difference does end up being larger than that by the end of the book. Like I think it might be closer to 10 years apart from the beginning to the very end, but
mhm.
yeah, it's just not a very large chunk of a person's life.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not like 10 years though, because they definitely mentioned that he's 20 at the end of it. And I think the youngest age they mentioned was 14. I want to say 12, but I can't remember exactly.
Oh, so 6 years max?
So, yeah. So yeah. Well, I mean, I guess that would
Well,
make it like 8
8 years.
years max. So I guess yeah, you're right. It is fairly close to 10. But that's still like in terms of like a fantasy novel, that's not a very big gap considering that she has characters in here who have lived for hundreds and hundreds of years, even
Yeah.
a couple that have lived for thousands of years, and then we're like micromanaging this one person's like 10-year gap. It was just I personally had a problem with keeping the timeline straight because I just at some point I couldn't recognize which timeline I was in immediately or all the time. And I know you didn't have as much trouble with it.
Yeah, I feel like I didn't have too much trouble with it. Partially, I think it might be the way I read, which is a little bit more slow and steady.
Mhm.
So there weren't as large of gaps where, I didn't have time to forget where I was in the previous chapter.
Yeah, whereas so Charlotte, like she said, she reads very slow and steady, whereas I tend to read a lot all at once. So I will sit down with a book and I'll read 150, 200 pages in a day, and then I won't pick it up again for like a week and a half to 2 weeks. It just depends on my schedule and how things are working out. Whereas Charlotte is a lot more slow and steady, and she'll read, 25, 30 pages a day, and she'll just keep doing that every day.
Yep.
So yeah, it is probably something to do with our reading styles. I know that does seem to come up every once in a while when we're talking about books, just because I don't always remember every detail as well, just because I do speed read through a lot of it.
It just definitely changes your experience of reading the book.
Yeah, I did take notes on this book though, because I wanted to try to remember things, and I don't think that my notes ended up being that helpful.
Mhm.
So Kieran is introduced, and he is what they call gaished, which is Gaesh, and it was done to him. Basically, how a character in this world gets gaished is that somebody else summons a demon. The demon rips out part of Kieran's soul and then attaches it to like an object. And then whoever holds that object can tell Kieran to do anything that they want, and he has to do it or he dies.
Yeah.
And I thought that that was going to be a lot more important than it ends up being.
If you read the
I
back
mean,
cover of the book, it's like hyped up that that's part of his problem.
yeah, that's like hyped up as like almost his only problem,
Hmm.
and it doesn't end up being that big of a deal. It kind of is at the very beginning, but it very, very quickly becomes not as much of an issue, especially once all the people around him are kind of keeping it a secret because he's more valuable than to them alive. And the Geish doesn't like differentiate between the person who gauged him versus anybody else. So it's literally like a trinket. So if I dropped it and Charlotte picked it up, now she has control of the gauged person. Like it's not like very specific to anybody.
Yeah. So basically, you
Which
could
seems
give the
like a
person,
flaw.
yeah, because you could give the person back the gauge, and they
Yeah.
would just be fine, basically, as long as they kept it hidden or something.
Yeah, as long as nobody found out that they were gauged. And you can't tell by looking at someone that that's happened to them.
Hmm.
And yeah, it's just not that important because basically, like, it starts off with him. It starts off with him as a slave, and the Black Brotherhood buys him because they know something that he doesn't know, which is just like a theme throughout the entire novel.
Yeah.
And basically, like, they hold onto his gauche, but they don't use it ever on him. And then
No, in
at one
fact,
point, and at one point they give it back to him because they
well,
want
and
him to trust him.
even before that, they have an issue where one of their orders conflicts with his previous orders, and then they just give an order that cancels all of his previous orders.
Yeah.
Basically, so he's entirely free again, because if you don't have any standing orders, and then there's nothing for you to do that could bring about your death. So
Yeah, like even accidentally, because the orders stack even between, I guess, masters. I suppose.
yeah,
I don't know if they use a term specifically.
it didn't sound
Yeah,
like
but then
it.
like at that point, after that point, it's never used on him again.
Mm-hmm.
Just never. And it's really weird because, like I said, the whole thing is framed, and so Kieran starts his story there, but Talon starts his story later. And then at the very end of Kieran telling
I thought it
his
was the
timeline
opposite.
story. Oh,
I,
no, you're right. She
yeah,
does start it earlier. But so when the earlier timeline ends and coincides with it, he's not gauged at the end of that. So he's really only gauged at the very beginning of this book, and then it doesn't matter
yep.
after that point, like at all.
It
And I was
becomes like a
like,
cool,
why?
like there's a cool twist with it at the very end, but it has nothing to do with someone like using the geisha on him. So
Yeah. Yeah. And I was just like, okay. And I kept waiting for it to be important. And that's why I don't know if me taking notes during this book was even important or not, because there's so many things that are introduced and they don't necessarily they're not they don't feel important. And
yep.
I know that this is the first book in a 5-book series. 4 of the 5 books are currently out now, but I don't know. I'm not going to sit around and read 4 more books to find out like what this one thing in book 1 was about.
No.
And I think that's a big problem with the novel overall, is that things don't necessarily feel very weighty, and part of that has to do with the framing device. I am not a fan of this type of framing device unless you use it fairly sparingly. Like if you frame it and it's like the first third of your novel or something, I'm like, okay, yeah, I can kind of get that. But to use it to frame, a good 450 pages of the novel, I'm like,
That's too
because I
much.
know Kieran is going to live, and so is Talon. Until the framing device ceases to be a framing device, I don't have to worry about them surviving,
Yeah,
which is
and
huge
the
in fantasy.
which you do go beyond the framing device at the very very end, and it was really funny
Mhm.
because there's a part 1 when you open the book, and by the time we got to part 2, I had forgotten that it ever said part 1, and
Yeah.
we had a moment where we were very confused because Corrie went back and looked at it and was like, there was a part 1. When did we miss part 2? Like, did it not happen? And
Yeah, because we were getting towards the end, and I was like, because I was flipping towards the beginning, and I was like, there was a part 1. Where's the other part?
yeah, because
Like,
normally we'll mention to each other like, oh, I stopped at part 1, or I stopped at like part 3, because that's a really easy way
yeah,
to divide the book. But
yeah,
that doesn't work for this book because part 2 is very close to the end of the novel.
it's like 50 to 70 pages before the end. And actually, so we just got the 4th book in at the bookstore that I work at, and I flipped through it just because I was kind of curious, and she did the same thing in that one too, where there's a part
Yeah.
1 and then the part 2 is like 50 pages from the end. And it's just like, why? Like, why did you bother doing a part 2 if this
Because
is it?
that's where she left the framing device behind.
Yeah, but
But
you could have just left it behind at any point.
yeah, yeah.
And she doesn't technically leave it behind right there because it's the secondary framing device is still at the very end.
Okay, she dropped one of the 2 framing devices.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is problematic. It's a
Yeah.
bit confusing. The footnotes are kind of fun. Like we actually both, I think, really enjoyed them.
Footnotes are
But
hard to pull off in
yeah.
novels to begin with. So pulling them off pretty well is admirable.
Yeah. But to stack the 2 framing devices, it's just a lot.
Yeah.
So where are we gonna go from here?
You know what? I was just trying to think of that because I keep looking at this. I have the book in front of me and I keep looking at my notes and realizing how useless these notes are because it seemed like I took notes based on when characters were introduced. I took notes based on when things were like explained. He has a dream with one of the goddesses. There in this fantasy world, there's three main goddesses that we talk about throughout the whole thing, and everybody like has a goddess. Their goddess is one of the three or whatever, and his is Taja, who's the goddess of luck.
Mm-hmm.
And he has a dream. He visits him, and I marked it in here because I thought, oh, this seems really important. But it's like it doesn't matter later on.
Well, I think so. I think the dream that she had, or the dream that he had, where she visits him, was more foreshadowing for the rest of the series, in my opinion. But it
Yeah,
it never really matters in this book. No.
no. I something that we talked about a lot when we discussed this book outside of this podcast is that there's a lot of misinformation in this book. And part of me likes that because it feels very realistic that you learn information and you find out that that information was false or partly false. There's a lot of questioning people's identities in this book.
Mm-hmm.
And so you hear from this older character that like, oh, this is actually so and so, or you hear this is how this person came to be, and then you find out that that's not true. And you're like, okay, I mean, I guess it makes sense because it's a big world. There's lots
Mm-hmm.
of people talking about everybody. So you're not going to get 100% accurate information all the time. But it got to be really annoying because at some point I started to just feel like I couldn't trust anything that anybody says. Kieran's identity is brought into question a lot, and I don't fully understand who or what he is at this point.
Yeah,
And
there
it's
was a
just really
point.
confusing.
There was a point where, let's just say, we had to check the end of the book to see how he was connected to another character, and then we were kind of like, oh, but then that oh didn't have any weight because we still didn't really know what that meant in practical terms.
Yeah. Yeah, because there's a big character reveal at the end, and I was like, I don't know who this person is at all. But it's like played like this dramatic, like turn and reveal kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just like, I don't know who this is. And so I texted Charlotte, and she was like, yeah, I don't know who it is either. And I was like, oh, good. I'm glad we're both on the same confusing page. But it seems like that kind of thing happened like too often.
Quite a bit. Yep.
It was just like, I don't know who any of these people are. There's fantasy has a lot of characters in it,
Yeah.
and it tends to be it has a reputation for being a little confusing in that way because you do tend to have just a lot of characters with a lot of weird names and a lot of weird name places, and they travel a lot trying to hold a map head, and then you have to have all these like family histories and family trees and all of this. So it does have a reputation for having that confusion, but I've never been so confused because of misinformation before this book. And that's the thing that I think got me more than anything else, because fantasy is already confusing and now you're making it even more confusing by telling me information that is just patently false.
Yeah.
That you as the author know is false, but I have to figure it out later. And
Mm-hmm.
now I have to remember who told me that information and whether they have corrected information, and then whether the character that I'm following believes the corrected information or whether they believe the false information. And it just got to be too much. I can't hold that many timelines in my head.
It becomes a lot of work. Yeah. And it feels like work instead of just enjoying the world and feeling like you're immersed in the world. It just feels like a list of things you need to remember.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know. There's some naming things in here that I think were supposed to make it a little easier, but they were just more confusing by the end of it.
Yeah.
Like, oh, this person, like this race of peoples, they name their kids and they have like the end of the father's name at the beginning of the kid's name.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's how it was. And I was like, is that supposed to be less confusing or no? And then it's even more confusing because then you have characters who are soul swapping all over the place.
Yes.
And that, I, I've never read
Yeah.
a book with
I
soul
think
swapping. I think it's a really interesting and cool kind of concept. I did really, really like the idea of it. But in practice, it just became way too much for me
yeah.
to deal with.
Well, so I would say also it's funny to me because I think that the back of the book, like I said, makes the geisha seem like it's going to be the big thing, but really the Stone of Shackles and the ability to soul swap when you're wearing it is what actually takes up most of the book.
Yes. Yes.
Which basically Kieran starts off. Kieran has always had that stone around his neck, and then he finds out in the course of the book what it is. And he finds out pretty early, so I don't feel like that's really a spoiler to just
Well, we
say
don't
what
find
it
out
is.
100% what it does. That's the thing is also that you don't find out what things do for a while.
Yeah, yeah.
Like he has this stone and like some people tell him that it's this and some people tell him that it's this other thing and then people are like, "Oh, we
Misinformation.
don't fully understand it." And it's like, like if you don't want me to know what it does right off, like that's okay. I don't have to until
Mhm.
like the plot demands it, but don't tell me five different things that it does because I'm so confused. I don't have any idea. And then when you tell me what it does, I can't remember that because I've already had to remember five other purposes for it that are possibilities.
Yeah, so it's a really cool object, and like you said, I think it's a really
Mhm.
cool idea, and it's something that television does a lot really well, but television's so much more visual, and like the
Mhm.
actor can give you clues that they're not being the person that they were or whatever. Whereas in this, it's just kind of like you just have to remember.
Yeah. And then she doubled up on that kind of concept because then she had Talon, and Talon is a mimic. So
Hmm.
basically, like, she kills people, and if she eats their brains, then she absorbs their memories, and she can literally become them. Like, she mimic. So she can mimic everything about them physically, and she has all their memories. So then you had the whole soul, so you had soul swapping, and then you also had a mimic running around. So then you had to remember who the mimic killed, who she was actually like mimicking, and then I can't think of another word now. This has escaped me. It's just going mimic, mimic,
Parodying?
mimic.
I don't know.
But anyway, so you had to remember who she killed, whether or not she was mimicking them, and then you had to remember who's had the Stone of Shackles, who soul swapped with it, and who actually died with it, and
Mhm.
then who wants to die with it. And it was just like, it got to be so much after a while because I think
Because
that having one of those in there would have been fine, but to have both a mimic that I had to keep track of and the Stone of Shackles and everything else to go on, it was just this book was so much.
and basically the Stone of Shackles acted as a plot device. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what it was there for. It was there to do cool things and like to be a
Hmm.
kind of chess piece that characters could use to their advantage or disadvantage or whatever.
Yeah, it
Um,
was there to be like a, oh, you thought they were dead, but they're not. And you're
mhm.
like, could we
Or
stop? Like,
you think this is this guy, but actually he swapped souls like a century ago, and this is him now.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, it's I think the mimic I like better, even though it is a more familiar character.
Yeah.
It was just more straightforward, and she's really fun. She's probably one of the characters I like the best in the book.
Yeah, same. I thought she was really good, but she does make it just that much more confusing.
So Kieran grew up basically with a father who wasn't really his father and who raised him to be kind of an entertainer, and he is also like a street thief just because
Hmm.
that's what he fell into because he has some magical ability, and that allows him to steal things. Because if you can at least see magic and avoid it, then you can obviously rob people easily.
Hmm.
And so he grows up on the streets, and his surrogate mother is the runner, the madam of a brothel. So he's kind of framed as like a rough and tumble character. But the funny thing is that he doesn't really come off that way to me for the
No.
most part. Like, he's not particularly crude. He's actually pretty modest in a way. Um, yeah, I
He's
so
really timid to start
yeah,
off with.
yeah, even though it's like he makes these comments about like being used to things and whatever, and but then he acts like they still bother him, and
Hmm.
yeah, it's very odd, and I think he didn't always feel genuine to me, I guess, as a character.
Yeah, he is like portrayed as kind of like selfish and self-centered, but then that's only like what we're told essentially because he's actually like a pretty nice person and he
Yeah.
does things, he goes out of his way to make sure that other people are taken care of.
Hmm.
He's not just so self-centered that he would like let horrible things happen to other people.
Like
So
he's
it's
not
just kind of weird.
stealing for fun. He's stealing because he's saving this money to, is it buy his dad a restaurant, basically? Or what was it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was to buy his dad like a bar or something up in the better part of town so that his dad doesn't have to play at brothels anymore.
Yeah, because his dad is blind. And so, yeah, so he's doing these things, but he's pretty purely motivated for a lot of it,
Yeah.
as far as
Yeah.
we can tell.
Yeah. I would agree with that. He just, I don't know. Yeah, you're right. He never really came off with things. And then like stuff about his character just kind of like is dropped as well. I know
Yeah.
I had a really big problem with that. I don't think I marked it in my book, but he has a run-in with a demon
Mm-hmm.
that like fairly early on in the story, and this like shapes him, like it traumatizes him, and it specifically sexually traumatizes him, and so for like pages and pages and pages we get the impression that he is traumatized, and he was a virgin before that,
Mm-hmm.
and like by choice, even though he grew up in a brothel.
Yeah.
So it was kind of like it was a very defining part of his character that he was a virgin by choice, and then he goes through this trauma, and now he like doesn't know if he can actually like be with a woman. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, but then there's just like this moment, and it's just there's a time jump,
Mm-hmm.
and in the time jump it's just like, oh, and then like 6 months passed and he started sleeping with this girl and they were fine, and I was like, but I just spent like a third of the book like dealing with this trauma and him
Yeah.
like having all these problems, and then all of a sudden it's just like gone. It's gone in like a paragraph. He just dropped.
Yeah.
And there's
Although I think,
another character that disappears too, the same way. Like she's a really big part of it, and then all of a
yeah.
sudden she's just like, oh, I guess she's not important anymore, and then she basically just disappears
Well, and
for
also
like the
I
rest of them.
think actually chronologically, I think the first person that he gets with is his stepmom. I think that scene technically takes place before the one you're talking about.
Oh, does
Before,
it?
yeah, because it's before he's even gauged, right?
Yeah, that would be before he was gauged. Yeah, but that's a spoiler, but that wasn't technically his stepmom.
Yeah, yeah. It wasn't tech. It was actually Talon.
Yeah. Is that really? See, that's what I mean. I don't fully understand the
Yeah,
timelines. It's
but
starting to
it
get
does
confusing as to
because she
figuring out.
talks
Is
about
that how it would work?
she talks about trying to get him over it in that scene. That's
I
why
wish
she
I
like
had marked that,
she
because
gets
now
him
I'm
really
like
drunk.
questioning.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, she takes advantage of him,
Yeah. So,
which we find out is a fairly common thing that happens when you're brought into like a house of royalty. We're skipping
mhm.
over a lot of things that happen, but Kieran goes through a lot in his life. But yeah, I don't know if that actually is like before.
Well, the thing is, Kieran goes through a lot of things in his life, but then they don't seem to necessarily affect him on an actual character level.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that he's very different from the Kieran that we meet in the beginning to the Kieran that is like at the end. He's still
Yeah.
like weirdly altruistic with no real reason behind it, and he doesn't have very good motivation.
It's like she wanted to go for like the innocent kid who gets ruined by the world, but then she also wanted to go with like the streetwise urchin who is part of this underground society thing, and
Yeah,
and those two
but then
things are kind
not
of
have,
contradictory.
yeah, and they're a little mutually exclusive, I guess,
Yeah.
because you can't have both of those things, but I guess she kind of wanted both. But
Mhm.
he is like too nice. He's too
Yeah.
nice to be a street urchin.
Mhm.
But I don't know. Like, yeah, the trauma doesn't mean anything though. Like, it doesn't actually change him. Like, I thought we were building up to a change in his character, and then it sort of just dropped.
Yep.
Like, I thought it was supposed to be a really big deal because it's been a really big deal up until a point, and then it's just kind of gone. And you're like, oh. And he doesn't really change that much. And there
No.
is a moment later on, I think you brought it up, when he's talking to Wraith, who's a really big character in this,
Mhm.
and asks Kieran why he's doing all the things that he's doing, because Kieran is basically like he's like trying to save the world, I
Mhm.
guess, in a very concrete way. And Therese is like, well, why are you doing this? Like, you could probably just run away.
Yeah. And his answer is just because I can.
Yeah, there's just nothing. He's just like, because I
Nope.
can do it. And I'm just like, that's a stupid motivation. That's the
Yeah.
motivation of like why somebody like wrote a crappy novel. I don't know. Like your motivation for watching a TV show.
And up until
Because I
that point,
can.
he's been like talking about how much he just wants to go home, and like that's kind of it. Which
Yeah.
is funny though, because most of the people he knows are dead or want to
Yeah.
be dead. So it
Yeah,
doesn't
they
really make any sense.
basically, yeah, when he leaves where he grew up from, everybody that he cares about is one lady. And he doesn't know for sure if she's alive or not.
Yeah.
And that's it. Like, and then you just kind of walk away.
Yeah.
Just like, okay. And then his reason for saving the world is because he can. And I
Hmm.
don't know if that's just because she wanted to lean back on the street urchin kind of thing,
Yeah.
or because she does in the very beginning. Talon starts off with saying that Kieran ruined his own life because he's just so darn curious
Hmm.
as to find things out. And I was like, that would have been an even better motivation than just because I can.
Hmm.
I don't know. I really hated that scene
Yeah.
because we're building up. I mean, we've been reading hundreds and hundreds of pages of stuff about this world and about these characters, and then we find out that he's just doing it because he can. Like, that's stupid. That's a villain motivation.
Yeah. Yep. There's no right or wrong or anything like that. There's no hint of what he actually feels or believes. It's just,
Hmm.
eh, I'm there and I know I can do this, so why not?
Yeah. Yeah. There's a
It's
whole
almost
thing with
like he just wants to see what his own abilities can do, I guess, kind of.
yeah. And there's that whole thing with the dragon that doesn't seem to really like make matter, I guess.
Yeah. So basically, the plot of the old Kieran is people come after him. Basically, he has the run-in with the demon. He makes a decision to go see this general, even though his dad tells him not to, and that turns out to be his dad is hiding his identity, basically, and he's a
Hmm.
member of a royal family. And so they bring him into the royal family's house, and that's where he ends up learning a bunch of stuff, a bit about who he actually is, all of that kind of stuff. And then at one point, obviously, because you have to catch up to the other timeline, he gets kidnapped and then he gets gauged. And then in the second timeline, he's bought by the Black Brotherhood. He's brought to an island because basically they're running from the other person who wanted to buy him as a slave. And the only way for them to escape is to this island where the goddess of death sometimes lives.
Yeah.
And
And there's a
he,
dragon.
yeah, he ends up stuck there because the dragon takes an interest in him and basically won't leave him alone, but the dragon can't come on the island either. So,
Hmm.
yeah.
So he's safe on the island, but he just keeps talking about how much he wants to go home.
Yep. Even though, like we said, so all of that in the past that happened, his when he becomes a member of the royal family, is this a spoiler, Corey?
I don't know. We already gave a spoiler warning.
I guess, yeah. His
We're
dad
probably gonna end
dies.
up talking about his identity a little bit anyway.
Yeah, so the blind guy who was acting as his dad anyway, he's not his real dad, and he knows that, dies during that, and then he gets brought to the royal family. So that's what we mean by, like, he had one other friend and she also dies in that scene.
Yeah.
So then it's like, there's no reason for him really to want to go back there. He doesn't like his new family, really, other than his brother, is it said Galen?
I did not look up the pronunciation. I said Gallon the whole time.
Oh, well, I was saying Galen in my head. You can say it however you want.
All right, that's fine.
His new brother, he kind of gets along with, even though his dad, the guy who claims is his dad, because again, his identity is whatever.
Question.
Darzin wants them to hate each other. Basically, he wants to pit them against each other, but they end up being close. And I did
Yeah.
like Galen.
I don't know. I hate him or anything. He
Yeah.
was like one of the least annoying characters till like the very end, and then you're like, okay, maybe you're a little annoying, but also he doesn't really get a very fair shake at the end
No.
in those scenes. He kind of like gets smacked on the head, and then he's unconscious for the rest of the book. So
Yeah, there's like
whatever.
I mean, there's obviously a giant time jump as well. So
Yeah. Yeah. But then I don't know if it really matters that he was part of the royal family or not. He didn't really like learn anything there because he spends his whole time training on the island, which happens after he's part of the royal family, even though he's supposed to be training with the royal family. But it's also revealed that he only spent 6 months
Yeah,
as part of like a royal family, which I thought was a particularly short period of time.
yeah. Not long enough for him to do much. I mean, he had some sword fighting training and some introductions to some people and stuff, but
Yeah,
that's about it.
yeah. Can we? Is it too much of a spoiler to talk about the Ruin of Kings? Because I'm still kind of salty about it.
No, you can talk about it.
The Ruin of Kings, the title of the book, is the name of a sword that's
Hmm.
supposed to be really big and important. And I actually can't remember anything that they talk about besides that they just talk about its big important sword. And the big bad guy, which there's problems with the big bad guy anyway,
Yes.
but the big bad purpose is just to find this sword, which you don't find out that that's his purpose until like the very end of the book. And I was
Hmm.
like, this is kind of a stupid purpose because he goes
Yeah.
about looking for this sword in like the stupidest way. I don't understand why he did it this way, but whatever. So
Hmm.
he's looking for the sword, and he like goes into the building to look for the sword, and then freaking Kieran like trips over it,
Yep.
and he picks it up. And I was like, are you for real? Like, I get that it's like the whole like, oh, it was in plain sight the whole time because it's literally like out in the middle of like an arena.
Hmm.
But like, that's the dumbest. Like,
Yeah.
I don't have any words apparently
And
because I was
also,
just so mad about it. Like, it
yeah.
was just so stupid. I was like, this is the dumbest thing ever. Like, I understand that Kieran's goddess is the goddess of luck, but I
Mhm.
mean, there's luck and then there's like just outright plot convenience.
Yep. Yeah. It just it and I think the title again is misleading because you also find out what and she doesn't do the best job of explaining their political system.
No.
But basically these royal families are not in charge of like actual political power. They each have like a section of the economy instead.
Mhm.
So Kieran happens to be part of the demons. Wait, is it daemons?
I think it's technically demons, but I said
Oh.
demon the whole time.
Well,
There's a pronunciation guide in the back that we're patently ignoring.
yep.
Or
So
blatantly ignoring.
demons. It's
Yep,
fine.
it's cool.
Uh, anyway, so he's part of them, and they're in control of healing and healers. So they have people who can do that kind of magic in their family and whatever, and under their control. And there's a bunch of other families that are like that. And then there's a separate group of people called the Voices of the Council, and they
Hmm.
have the actual political power beneath the Emperor, who basically the emperor is chosen by everyone goes into that arena where he found the sword and they fight to the death and whoever wins becomes the
Is
next
emperor.
emperor.
Yeah, and the emperor is given by the arena. He's given the crown and the scepter, and they make him immortal.
Yep.
So he's very difficult to kill after that point. So most
Yeah.
emperors will reign for several hundred years.
Yep.
Where
So
were you going
so
with this?
where I was going with this was the title of the book is The Rune of Kings, and there are no kings.
Oh my gosh,
There is
you're right.
only an emperor.
Yep,
So who
it's
are we
true.
ruining? What is this about? We don't even know.
Yeah. Especially since the sword has like 55 different names.
Yeah.
Could have picked any one of them.
Yep. So
Yeah, I really didn't understand their politics at all, which that's not as big a deal for me, but I do know that you're a little bit more interested in that
mhm.
aspect of things. So it makes sense that that would be something that really grinds your
Well,
gears. I
because
just
yeah,
got
it's
mad
part of
about
the
the
world
stupid
building.
sword.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. They do, and they talk about like god kings or something, and I
Yeah.
don't have any idea like what that actually meant to them. And I guess we should probably talk about the bad guy
Mm.
who's not really introduced.
Until very late.
Yeah, so it's Gadrith.
Hmm.
And everybody thinks Gadrith's dead, but he's not really dead because nobody in this book is really dead ever.
Yep.
And is essentially inhabiting his own corpse,
Yes.
which is kind of weird, and I sort of like the concept.
Yeah, me too.
There's so many things in here where I'm like, wow, I like that concept, but I really don't like the way you executed it.
Yeah.
But so like I said, his whole point is to just find the sword, And I don't get it. I actually don't remember why
He's
he needs
trying to
the sword
fulfill
so bad.
he's trying to fulfill prophecies basically that he thinks are all leading up to like him gaining power.
Yeah. Oh, the prophecies are great too
Mm,
because they're so confusing. Nobody, so like if you think of like Harry Potter, it's like, oh, he's the boy who lived.
yeah.
There you go. That's the prophecy. He's
Well,
the
no,
chosen one, whatever.
the prophecy in Harry Potter is more spelled out than that, but yes.
Yeah, but I mean, it is spelled out though.
It is spelled
You
out. It's
I
one
get it.
prophecy.
And it's
Yep.
that like if you read like Percy Jackson, an oracle, and they tell like what's up. And in most books, when there's a prophecy, you at least get it like one time where
Mhm.
somebody tells you the prophecy or they tell you like a story. This is the prophecy. This is, whatever
Mhm.
that's been passed down for generations. You don't get that in this book at all. You
Nope.
never get the whole prophecy. There's no point in this book where somebody just says, "Let me tell you a story," and they tell you the story of the prophecy, or even like there's this weird part where he like goes to some random place and he sees on the walls that there's a story of like 8 people and there's like stars and like beams coming out of people and I'm like,
Oh
I don't
yeah.
know what's going on. I'm
Mhm.
so confused.
Well, that
And
was about the
then
past.
yeah, but it's like that had something to do with what was going on.
Yeah.
It was just so confusing. And then there's one point where he's talking to one of the council, the voices,
Mhm.
and the voice is like, "Oh, haven't you heard the prophecy? Ha ha ha." And he's like, "No, I actually haven't." And I was like, "Oh, yes, please
This
tell
is
me
the
the
moment.
prophecy, sir. This is it. Just give me like 2 or 3 lines. Just tell me what's going on." And he doesn't. He just
Nope.
stops. He just doesn't tell him. And I was just like, "Why are you like this? If you're going to have a prophecy in your book, tell me the prophecy. And if you don't
Yeah.
want to write a prophecy, just don't have a prophecy. Or just be
Yeah.
like, the prophecy's been lost, but some people say it's this. And then just give me a version of it. I don't know.
Mhm.
I'm obviously like fairly worked up about this. It just
Yeah.
bothered me so much. I just kept waiting for it. I think that's what got me. Is I just every time I turned the page, I was like, "Am I gonna know what the prophecy is?" Because everybody references it and nobody tells you what it is.
And I think we talked about at one point in our conversations previous to this podcast that she does that a lot where she runs into like a hard thing and she just chooses not to write about it instead of
Yeah,
like addressing it in any way. So
yeah,
it does feel like she didn't want to write a prophecy, so she just chose to like pussyfoot around it basically.
yeah.
And
She
yeah.
didn't want to write about his trauma
Mhm.
like being resolved in a real world way. So she just
Yeah.
didn't write it.
Yep. And she didn't even do like a kind of time jump or anything that would make sense for it to have faded or anything. She just ignored it,
Yeah,
which isn't a great, it doesn't feel very satisfying as a reader.
no. And I don't know if these are things that are going to come up later in the rest of the books. Um,
Hmm. Yeah, like
I'm
maybe
not
there actually is a
planning
prophecy
on
in the
the
second.
rest. Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I don't know.
We didn't, are we going to do our star ratings? We didn't do that yet.
Oh yeah, we didn't. I just thought of that too. Um, yeah, I think I kept it at 3.
Yeah. I
I
also kept it at 3, which is kind
yeah,
of, we would
the
describe
base.
before as our baseline.
Yeah.
Um, it was just, there was a lot of interesting concepts and ideas and characters, but most of them feel peripheral to what happens and don't get fully explained or explored in this book.
Yeah. Yeah. I you hit the nail right on the head. That is exactly how I feel about it too. Because I just kept saying it over and over again. I was like, that's a good concept,
Hmm.
but there's not a really good execution of it. I think the soul swapping has probably the best execution and it's unnecessarily confusing because of the peripheral things going on around it.
Yeah. And I think she writes some really great action scenes in this. Like there's some stuff about like a giant squid and the dragon we keep
Mhm.
mentioning is actually pretty cool and like does some cool
Yeah.
stuff with magic and the way that they leave the island is actually kind of neat. But the moments like that are pretty spread out and they're more like episodic, I'd feel like.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like this whole thing could make a really good TV show.
Hmm.
Really. And I think that you could get a lot more visually from it. Like you could drop more information
Hmm.
with visuals in this.
Yeah.
Um,
Like all the royal colors actually wear house colors, and that would make it a lot more vivid and interesting on a TV show to see the different colors working at their different jobs and all of that.
Yeah. Yeah, and to actually see some of the characters would be really cool. Because I didn't fully understand what some of the characters were supposed to look like,
Hmm.
but I think that that's just another problem with it, is that I think the world is really cool, but at the same time we don't get that much of it. We don't feel like we're there. I feel
Yeah.
like we get just enough to kind of get a sort of lay of the land in a way, and then that's it.
Yeah, because Kieran's only in the capital city and on this island, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah, he really doesn't go anywhere else. Well, he goes to one other place, but
Oh
he
yeah.
goes through like a portal, and I really still did not fully understand or grasp how that worked or what
Me neither.
exactly was happening there. Because he very abruptly goes to another place, and you get like a lot of exposition, but it's at a point in the story where you're already so overloaded with different information that I feel like I didn't process it as well as I could have.
Yeah. Kieran is trying to use more magic, and so he enlists the help of a witch named
Mhm.
Tysento to basically she's gonna possess him and teach him magic that way, which just
Yeah,
sounds really bizarre. And basically he freaks out by when he gets possessed because it gives him flashbacks to the demon, which is like the one time that really happens in the book. And
yeah.
they somehow teleport.
Yeah, and I was like, "Oh, okay, we're here now. All right, whatever, I guess." And then it doesn't even matter that he learned more magic because he doesn't use it in the end.
Nope.
That's another thing. You brought that up when we were
Mhm.
discussing the ending before because he goes through all of this training and stuff on the island. Like there's a whole time jump. That's like a long time. It's like a 2-year time jump.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden we're just supposed to take his word for it that he's like super well trained and he can fight and he can sword fight and he can use magic like crazy and blah blah
Mm.
blah blah blah. And then he doesn't do anything.
Nope.
Like he has like one sort of fight and then that's it. Because
Yeah.
Gadrith doesn't see him as worth his time. So even when he's like face to face with Gadrith, Gadrith is like, I'll have my second in command of him instead. And then Gadrith literally walks away.
Yeah.
He's
So
just like,
Kieran never
okay.
has the big fight that he's been preparing for this whole time, supposedly.
No, and even in that fight, when Gadrith gives him his second in command to fight,
Hmm.
like this second is really powerful. And Kieran is like, I can't beat him. And I was like, what have you been doing for 2 years?
Yeah, I was like, how are we supposed to believe you can save the world if like the first guy you try to fight, you don't even think you can win?
Yeah, I was like, what is that supposed to mean? Like you're just useless, I guess.
Yeah. And basically the overarching story, so the reason not the reason, but I mean the demon possessing him and all of that is partially to bring up the overarching thing that I imagine will continue into the rest of the series, which is that demons are trying to retake the mortal world and the gods and goddesses are preventing that from happening, and the prophecies all relate to that, supposedly.
Yeah. Which
And
also, sorry, go on.
no, and my problem with it is that it never felt like it mattered on a global scale what Kieran was doing. And I think it was supposed to. It was supposed to be like, oh, if he doesn't do this, something bad will happen. But I never was clear on like what were the consequences of any of this. So, or I didn't know what the consequences were of Kieran doing anything.
Yeah. No,
So
I
like
agree with that. It never felt like it mattered on a global scale. Nothing really feels very global in this book, honestly. It's a
no.
huge fantasy world, but nothing ever really like felt like it was really affecting anything. There's like one moment, oh, it's when the Prince of Demons is like running amok and you switch to some random person's perspective
Hmm.
for like 4 paragraphs. And I was like, why couldn't we get more of this throughout
Yeah.
the whole book?
Yeah.
Because that made the place feel so real. Because you watch this one character, and she's just a random character, like on a dock or something like that. But you suddenly, like, very suddenly got a very close, intimate feel for a random person in the world and how this was affecting them.
Yeah.
And you just don't get anything else like that in basically the whole book because everything else is just very close to all the characters. Kieran is relatively isolated from everything
Yeah.
for most of his story. He's on a slave ship.
Mm-hmm.
He's in a royal household. He's on a random island in, the ocean.
Yep.
So it's not like he's not, on the streets that much. He's on it for a very short period of time. And I guess like you see him interact with one of the fences
Mm-hmm.
that he uses to sell stolen goods. And even that, it didn't feel like very real or intimate or anything, but he's like really upset when that character dies.
Yeah. Yeah. It was like the interaction with that character was fine, but it wasn't like, I don't know. Again, it
I
didn't
didn't
really
feel
feel like it
anything.
mattered.
Yeah,
No.
I didn't feel anything for most of the characters that died. I didn't really feel anything for. I can't remember any in particular that I was like, oh wow, I'm actually really sad. Well, okay, at the very end, I was kind of sad when one of the characters died,
Yeah.
but they don't stay dead, so who cares?
Yeah. Well, and like we said, it's kind of a book where no one does stay dead because basically the goddess of death can choose to return people to life, which is a cool concept, but again, it just undercuts the weight of everything because it's like,
Yes,
oh, well, even if a character dies, they can like go to Thaina, or I don't know how to say her name.
I just said Thana.
Thana. That makes more
Yeah,
sense. They can go to Thana and just she'll return them to life for you.
yeah.
Maybe.
And if she
So
doesn't, I guess they're dead, but there's always like that possibility. And she
yeah,
doesn't have to return them right then either. She could just be like, yeah, I'll just send them, in 10 years and I'll reincarnate them. Which is
yeah,
another weird concept because there's the concept of being returned from the dead, but then there's also the concept of reincarnation in this book too.
yes.
And I think that having both is kind of odd
Mhm.
just because it does make death feel like not very permanent at all.
Yeah.
Because some
Yeah.
characters remember their past lives, and then some characters don't. And then that gets really annoying because some characters seem to know who Kieran is, and Kieran doesn't even know who he himself is.
Mhm. Yeah.
And
But it's
that's like
also
part of the story is figuring out who Kieran actually is.
and it's also implied that you can just figure out your past lives, which I'm like, well, could everyone do this or is it only certain people or like there's just so many complications to it.
Yeah, there are not a lot of moments where the rules are explained, and a lot of times when they are explained, they're explained partially, and then they're re-explained partially later, and you find out that part of what you learned was wrong, which is
Yeah.
just another way that she muddies the water
Mhm.
with a lot of exposition. I feel like if you cut out all of like the just misinformation that characters share betwixt themselves and the information that's shared, the misinformation that's shared in good faith,
Mhm.
because that's what gets me about it is not that like it's just the bad guy telling you things and then you find out that he was lying, because like obviously
Mhm.
you're gonna find out that he's lying, but a lot of times it was characters that you trusted, and this is what they truly believe, and you're just like, but it's not true. But
Yeah.
if you took all that out, I feel like it'd be a much shorter book.
Definitely. Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, she could have gone without the framing devices. She could have also picked a different character. I don't know. Kieran just wasn't that interesting for me to
No.
follow. Like I get that he's supposed to be important in these prophecies and stuff and because of his identity, which we're not going to give you because it's a spoiler, but it's like I just wasn't that invested in him. And if I spent 500 pages, this is why I don't want to read the next book. It's because if I spent 500 pages with one of your characters and I don't really care where he goes next, then you didn't really do it for me.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I like the world enough that I feel like if I wanted to go on to the next books, it would just be something that I would like casually read on the side,
Mhm.
just pick up occasionally, because I'm not going to sit there and try to figure out everything that's going on. It would be more like, I don't know, this series feels like a journey where
Yeah.
you can't really focus too much on the end, because
Mhm.
then you'll probably ruin it for yourself anyway.
Yeah.
I don't know if I would necessarily recommend this to people. I think maybe once the fifth book comes out, I would be tempted to recommend it to someone if they told me that they really liked fantasy and they read decently fast.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you could sit down and read all 5 of these books, I'm sure that it would probably be pretty good. She's a very
Yeah.
competent writer for the most
Yeah.
part. I don't there's not like problems like misspellings or like grammar or anything like that. And I think that
Oh,
she does build decent characters. I think
yeah.
that you're right that the character she chose to follow is just kind of boring.
And everything feels plotted well as well. Like it does feel like it's building towards something larger. It's just unfortunately this first book, there's too few of those crumbs to get me invested enough in what happens later.
Yeah, I feel like this is very much the first book.
Hmm.
Like this is the first book in a grand epic tale. And it's like that's great. I think that if I do ever get around to reading the rest of the books, which won't be for a while because the 5th book's not out as of right now. If I did though, I feel like I could probably listen to these like in
Yeah.
audiobook form on like a long car trip or something. And I think that
Yeah.
I would probably genuinely enjoy reading the rest of Kieran's story.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to end up sitting down and physically reading these books.
Yeah, I guess that's the thing for me. This definitely wasn't a bad book. It's just it's such an investment and for not enough return. And I just am not at a point in my life where I can commit to series like that unless I really love them. So
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I feel the same way. I do think that I guess if you made it this far in the podcast, if
hmm.
you really enjoy the journey of reading
Hmm.
like very complex stories, I would recommend this series to you because I think that that's what it's going to end up being.
Yeah.
But I do think that the first book is a little too heavy on the setup and not enough payoff for me
Hmm.
to keep going with the series as of right now. Although it is something that I would not be totally opposed to picking up in the future or to trying to find like the audiobook or something.
Yeah, I agree. Do we have any final thoughts?
No, I feel like that was, I don't know. It almost felt like it was all over the place, but this is
Yeah.
just a really big book. It's really complicated. There's a lot of characters. We didn't even mention some of the characters.
Nope.
So, honestly, if you wanted to read this, um, if you're interested in it after listening to us rant and rave about it,
Ramble.
um, yeah, ramble about it, definitely check it out, honestly. It's not bad.
Mm.
We're very critical, but I want to be fair as well. I think that she's a very competent writer, and I think that she does plot well, as you said. So
Yeah.
we both gave it 3 stars. So let us know if you've read this book or if you want to read this book now that you've listened to us talk about it. Leave a like, comment, subscribe to our channel. We upload about an hour-long podcast once a month ish. This one is kind of a little out there, so we'll see when it actually gets out into the internet world.
You'll notice there's a lot of modifiers on that sentence.
There are. I mean,
We're
we do our best. We're doing this on the side,
life's a
so
little crazy.
it's just a good time. We just chat. So we have a few other podcasts that you can check out on our channel if you want to. Otherwise, I'm repeating myself now because I'm just rambling, which is the name of the channel. But like, subscribe, comment, etc., etc., etc. All right, bye.
Bye.